From aged Civil War cemeteries harboring expansive histories and ghostly echoes of the past, to creepy old churchyards where it's said the dead stalk those who wander too far. Are you ready for our second list of picks for some of the most haunted graveyards in America? Number 5. Laurel Grove Cemetery. Laurel Grove Cemetery, located between West Anderson and Collick Streets in Midtown Savannah, Georgia, is a historic graveyard housed on a portion of the former Springfield plantation that's renowned for holding the remains of a range of notable names from both local and U.S. history. The plot it sits on was first developed in 1850 as Savannah's older boneyards neared capacity and took its name after the native laurel oaks that once blanketed the region. In 1853, a keeper's house, porter's lodge, gazebo, and public holding vault were installed. It was decided the northern section would hold the remains of European immigrants, while the southern would be reserved for African American interments. By 1907, the northern end of the yard had hit capacity, and over the years, Laurel Grove South would grow to become one of the largest African American graveyards in the entirety of the Southeast. Sadly, by the 1930s, the aged yard had deteriorated significantly. Incidentally, in 1958, the state of Georgia would set aside funds necessary for the reconstruction, revitalization, and extensive cleaning of the plot, in addition to the installation of its wrought iron gates and boundaries. Currently, both sections of Laurel Grove remain open to the public, with burial services continuing at the South Yard to this very day. Over the years, both visitors and staff at Laurel Grove have reported a host of otherworldly phenomena, including disembodied footsteps heard tailing lone walkers, extreme cold spots, and the constant feeling of being watched. A spectral woman clad in a wedding gown has been spied wandering among the headstones, namely at night, and several fables tell cemetery grounds were once used in dark magic rituals, which may have resulted in the opening of a doorway or portal to the other side. One of the most famous stories surrounding Laurel Grove tells that when a trolley line used to pass by, everyone on board would hear the sound of a child crying, though no kids were ever present. While some versions of this tale further to tell crying ceased when the trolley line was removed, to this day many report hearing the same hair-raising squeals and screams as they walk or drive past. Lastly, reported across Laurel Grove are odd electronic malfunctions, disembodied voices, strange dragging noises, inexplicable lights in the sky, and apparitions in old-fashioned clothing sighted drifting about. Number 4. Camp Chase Confederate Cemetery. Camp Chase Confederate Cemetery, located off Sullivan Avenue about 6 miles to the west of downtown Columbus, Ohio, is a notable historic cemetery as well as most of what's left of the Camp Chase Union Army POW camp, which, through the Civil War, held thousands of captured Confederate troops. Camp Chase was first established in 1861 in Columbus, Ohio as a replacement for the earlier Camp Jackson, and was intended to serve as a training and recruitment center for the Union Army. During the Civil War, however, it was utilized to also serve as a prison camp, and held a number of soldiers, civilians, and others whose loyalty lied with the Confederacy. The camp's cemetery was established in 1863, and a number of bodies from the Columbus Yard were immediately reinterred at this new site. Towards the end of the war, the Union Army would halt operations at Camp Chase, and through the 1890s, a series of efforts to properly mark graves were executed. In 1904, Congress would set aside funds for the continued maintenance of the aging burial plot. Today, Camp Chase Confederate Cemetery holds an estimated 2,260 bodies. Most of the surrounding land, which once held the rest of the camp, has been drastically transformed into modern commercial and residential property. The cemetery remains open to the public into present times as an active historic site. Chillingly, food shortages among prisoners were all but common, with many suffering agonizing deaths from starvation. Additionally, through the winter of 1864, hundreds were lost in a brutal smallpox outbreak. Several visiting the cemetery, especially in the evening, have reported encounters with the full-bodied apparitions of soldiers, many of which appear emaciated and sickly. Reported across cemetery grounds are orbs captured in the backgrounds of photographs, extreme cold spots, shadowy figures, and the near constant feeling of being watched or followed by someone or something unseen. The most famous legend surrounding surrounding Camp Chase tells of the Lady in Gray, the apparition of a young woman in her early 20s, clad in all gray and carrying a white handkerchief. As the story goes, following the Civil War, townspeople began sighting her on cemetery grounds. Some claimed looking for her lost love. To this day, her ghost is sighted frequently and has been known to leave flowers on 2 separate graves, that of Benjamin Allen's and on the tomb of an unknown soldier, before fading through the fence into the night. Lastly, those who have braved the graveyard after dark have reported being overcome by a sudden and severe feeling of sadness, with a handful describing hearing the sounds of a woman's choked sobs, always from just out of sight. Number 3. Forest Lawn Memorial Park. Forest Lawn Memorial Park, located off South Glendale Avenue in Glendale, California, is a privately owned cemetery notable for playing home to the Hall of Crucifixion Resurrection, a space holding 2 of the largest and most renowned religious paintings in the Western Hemisphere. The graveyard itself was originally founded in 1906 by a group of wealthy San Francisco businessmen, and in 1912 Hubert Eaton and C.B. Sims were contracted. Eaton, whose innovations are largely responsible for making the grounds more park-like, is credited for having first established Forest Lawn Memorial Park, and is responsible for opening the original dedicated funeral home on site. In 1943, Eaton came upon the Crucifixion, a painting which had been unveiled in 1897 by Polish artist Jan Stika. He purchased the piece and constructed the Hall of Crucifixion as its grand display, opening the new structure to the public in 1951. The resurrection would be added to said display later in 1965, following its completion. In 1957, the Forest Lawn Museum was opened up on cemetery grounds, offering displays in both art and artifacts from around the world, one of the largest stained glass collections in North America, and rotating fine arts exhibits. The cemetery, its grounds, and all associated buildings remain open to the public to this day, with Forest Lawn boasting an estimated 250,000 interments. Cemetery services continue into present times, with some of the most notable burials including Walt Disney, Michael Jackson, Clark Gable and Carole Lombard, and many others. Adjacent to one another are Babyland and Lullaby Land, 2 separate sections dedicated to small children and infants. These zones are plotted out in the shape of a heart, with the graves of the children's mothers surrounding. Many nearing this area have reported hearing the sounds of children laughing, crying, playing, and calling out to their parents, and, less often, the sounds of women weeping. Across the yard, many report orbs both caught in photographs and visible to the naked eye, shadowy figures that dart about, and full-bodied apparitions in clothing spanning the eras. Many have described hearing otherworldly moaning and crying from the trees at night, and unearthly shrieks on the wind. Also reported at Forest Lawn is the near constant feeling of being followed by someone or something unseen, and the sensation of being brushed up against, touched, or even grabbed by invisible hands. Lastly, the Great Mausoleum holds the remains of several prominent figures, one of the more infamous of which just might be 12-year-old Marion Parker, daughter to banker Perry Parker. In 1927, Marion was kidnapped and brutally murdered. Her killer was eventually captured in Echo, Oregon, and was convicted and hanged just a year later in 1928. Although the Great Mausoleum is closed to the general public, those who have gone inside or gotten too near it have reported what they've claimed sounds like a girl crying from within. Number 2. St. Paul's Chapel and Churchyard. St. Paul's Chapel and Churchyard, located off Broadway between Vesey and Fulton Streets in the Manhattan borough of New York City, New York, is a church and graveyard that together boast reputations as being both the oldest public building continuously in use and the oldest church building outright in the whole of Manhattan. The chapel was initially constructed in 1766 by Trinity Church and was purposed to serve the Anglicans in what was, at the time, the outskirts of the city. Through the dawn of the 19th century, following Manhattan's banning of in-city burials, churchyard services were largely ceased, though occasional family interments in vaults were still permitted under special circumstances up into the early 1900s. Tragically, and still fresh in many of our hearts, the World Trade Centers were destroyed on September 11th of 2001 in a brutal attack. Building 5 of the compound stood just across Church Street from St. Paul's, with the Twin Towers just blocks away. Though the church and graveyard were covered in debris and several headstones were broken, the chapel, remarkably, remained unscathed. For 8 months following the attack, the chapel would act as a relief center for recovery workers and as a shrine for mourners. In 2002, following a series of large-scale renovations, the chapel was reopened to the public, with the churchyard opening later in 2003. The site remains open to this day, offering both exhibits and memorials in honor of those lost in the 9/11 attacks, alongside the New World Trade Center's redevelopment project, which, of course, sits right across the street. At St. Paul's, a range of paranormal activity has been experienced, with visitors reporting disembodied voices, knocking from within the walls, and whispering from empty areas. Many have described the sensation of constantly being surrounded by a crowd, even when alone, or the sudden feeling of sadness, of anxiety, of not being able to breathe. Also reported throughout St. Paul's are full-bodied apparitions in clothing spanning the eras, shadow figures that follow visitors, and the constant feeling of being watched or followed. Lastly, and most famously, the site is said to be haunted by one George Frederick Cook, an English actor who passed on in 1812 while on a tour of the city from complications of cirrhosis following a life of alcoholism. Legend has it that in 1821, when his body was moved from the stranger's vault to a proper grave with a monument, it was discovered that his head was missing. His skull is rumored to have made its rounds, first being utilized as a Yorick prop piece for productions of Shakespeare's Hamlet, and later in 1938 being passed along to the Thomas Jefferson Medical School Library in Philadelphia for a time, after which no one is certain what became of it. Whether the skull was initially stolen or donated is another heavily debated matter entirely. Since the date of its discovered absence, many visiting St. Paul's have reported encounters with the apparition of a headless man who roams the yard, seemingly searching for something. Many assume either the skull itself or his rightful burying place. Number 1. Greenmount Cemetery. Greenmount Cemetery, located off Greenmount Avenue in Baltimore, Maryland, is a historic rural cemetery recognized for its wide range of notable interments, ranging from historic figures to prominent Baltimore families, that is also acknowledged for its extensive and impressive arts collection, including its statuary. The burying grounds were officially established in 1838 on land purchased from heirs of the late Robert Oliver. Formerly, Oliver had utilized the plot to hold his country estate. A year later, in 1839, the graveyard was dedicated. Early planning of cemetery grounds were left in the hands of one Benjamin Latrobe, a civil engineer with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. This resulted in an almost garden-like atmosphere, and though it wasn't exactly recognized as such at the time, Greenmount was actually one of the earliest rural or garden cemeteries in the United States. From 1840 to 1846, the graveyard's entrance gateway was constructed, with the chapel following later through the 1850s. The mausoleum was constructed in 1930 and houses more than 675 full-sized crypts, more than 200 cremated remains, and multiple private family rooms. Through the 1930s, the chapel's basement was excavated in order to make room for the yard's original crematorium and columbarium. Today, Greenmount Cemetery holds more than 65,000 bodies, including those of former notable statesmen, philanthropists, artists, authors, military leaders, and more. The yard's grounds remain open to the public from Monday through Saturday, with all visitors requested to sign in at the front office. One of the most famous local legends surrounding Greenmount tells of a darker side to Robert Oliver. As the story goes, Oliver's daughter fell in love with a young man of which he did not approve. It's said that in an attempt to escape his controlling ways, the daughter dressed up as a man and tried to run away in the middle of the night. Unfortunately, she never made it past the door, as Oliver woke mid-escape, and, thinking her to be either an intruder or the boyfriend, dependent on the version of the tale, shot his own daughter dead. It's said that in his grief, he dedicated the property, or had it dedicated through family members, in her honor. Although this story is widely considered false, it hasn't slowed the passage of this fable from generation to generation, and into recent times, many nearing the old yard have reported hearing a very real-sounding lone gunshot that's even warranted calls to the police, who always arrive to find the area completely empty. Reported all across the yard are orbs visible to the naked eye, disembodied footsteps when no one else is around, ground, and both extreme hot and cold spots. Disturbingly, one of the yard's more infamous interments just so happens to be John Wilkes Booth, the man believed to have assassinated President Abraham Lincoln, and a number of reports detail encounters with a full-bodied apparition closely matching his description. Lastly, but certainly not least, buried within Greenmount is Elijah Bond, the creator of the ever-popular spiritual communication device, the Ouija board. Before his recognition, Elijah had been laid to rest in an unmarked grave. That is, until 2007, when his remains were located and a proper marker was installed. His headstone, which is rather fitting, depicts a full Ouija board on one side, and a handful of the more superstitious types have claimed it might actually act as a doorway to the other side. Many who've neared Elijah's grave recount terrifying instances in which the letters carved into it begin to glow, where they've been overcome by a powerful feeling of unease, or in which they hear disembodied voices encircling them, whispering, laughing, and crying, some sounding not of this world. Taking into account its ridiculously fascinating history, slew of purported paranormal infestations, and list of chilling ghost stories, we felt there was no more final a destination than Greenmount Cemetery as our pick for the most haunted graveyard in America. Thank you all for tuning in to our second list of picks for some of the most haunted graveyards in America. If you enjoyed hearing our histories and ghost stories as much as we enjoyed telling them to you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn notifications on so you get an alert when fresh content is on the way. Throw us a like if you feel we've earned it, and most importantly, share this video and our channel with anyone you think needs a good scare. We'll see you next time.